great pleasure to have Stefano back of Royal Holloway, visiting from the University of Cologne, where he's Professor of Transversal Aesthetics, which is very impressive. And Stefano, of course, is formerly not just of this parish, but Queen Mary for a long time, and University of Leicester, and was a major presence in British critical management studies for a long time, so it's brilliant to have him back. We're going to be talking about a book that he and Fred Moten wrote in 2013, isn't it?
Yeah,
the Undercommons, that Black Fugitive Studies, which was published by in imprint Minor Compositions by Stephen. And Stephen is probably fair to say the foremost avant-gardist of the business school.
That's true.
And reader at the University of Essex, and also a always great source of eclecticism and fascinating details in the alternative possibility of business studies. So brilliant to have the two of you here, and over to you, Stephen.
So I'm not Fred, but can I kick it?
You can kick it.
Yes, you can. Okay. So I want to talk about CLR James.
Okay.
And I want to talk about Beyond a Boundary.
Okay.
This is news for him. And why I want to talk about it is I finally read it. And there's a number of interesting things there. One thing I'm fascinated by, why he writes about cricket and not football, but we'll leave that aside for a second. But the thing I'm really fascinated by it is when you read it, it's obvious for James, his two passions at this point are cricket and literature. Mm-hmm. Like he asked at the very beginning, what does he who only knows cricket know? Mm-hmm. And it turns out a lot, because cricket is study. Mm-hmm. But these two passions are not just random, but are part of basically British colonial education. So for what I read it, I didn't learn a damn thing about cricket. But what I did learn is that the way I read it is it's CLR James trying to figure out his relationship to a thing that has structured himself, that he wants to maintain a relationship with, but he also wants to leave it at the same time. He wants to exit the colonial structuring of desire and selfhood, while also maintaining the parts that he wants to hold on to, the preservation bit. Mm-hmm. And that's why I thought was really fascinating about it, was not that I care about cricket at all, but I like how you have to negotiate your relationship to a thing that you are deeply invested in, but also realize that its structuring is kind of horrible.
Yeah.
How you leave but don't leave, how you hold on to but also not hold on to, how you go somewhere but not leave. And for me, that is the sort of abiding thought of the book. And many of the things you and Fred have done is we're in something. It makes who we are. We want to hold on to some bits, but we also want to escape some bits. And how do we constantly renegotiate and shift that while also leaving by not leaving? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. As a starting point? Is that enough kicking?
Yeah, that's enough. Thank you. Well, just give me a second to say thanks before.
Oh yeah.
Before I dive into that. First, hi. First, thank you, Alan. It's been a while since we've been trying to get this talk together, this conversation together. I'm glad we finally did it. Thank you for your persistence with me on that, and your flexibility and everything else. It's nice, to be back among friends. And however brief my Royal Holloway stay was, it was nonetheless, an experience that I remember very clearly. So it's good to be here, to see friends, also to see my friend Stephen, whose publication of our book has really sort of changed our lives in a way. We hadn't any idea when we published with him. We assumed that was the end of it. We never hear from him or anybody else again. But because he made the book free online, people were able to pick it up and look at it, and then they wanted to talk to us. So if you hadn't done that and suggested that form, a form which you've really worked on to make the form that you want in publishing, we wouldn't have had many of the opportunities that we've had. So I really want to thank you for that. And And, you know, sometimes a publisher can go unappreciated, but when one is really a partner like this in the whole intellectual activity, it's really important for me to say that. So I bought myself a little time to figure out what the hell you're talking about on CLR James by now.
Sorry.
No, I'm kidding. Thank you everyone for coming in on what's a nice day in London, which is rare enough, I'm sure. Well, I mean, I think for James, cricket is black popular culture. The literature stuff is a little more complicated for him. He tries it out. You know, he tries with the Barrack Yards stories and things, but I don't think he has such a successful, you know, relationship between something like a black vernacular literature and, you know, the literature he's taught through colonialism. But with cricket, I think he finds something where he's able to say, you know, yeah, of course we're imprisoned in this sport, you know, quite literally by all its rules and its style and everything else. And yet, you know, it's also a place where we express some other kind of, you know, social formation that can't fully come through. And it's, you know, he places it in the context of all the restrictions, and maybe the most famous and most well-known restriction is the story of the colorism in the different teams, right? Which, if you haven't read this, includes even the story of the brown paper bag that's hung over one of the doors to the cricket clubs. And if you're darker than the brown paper bag, you can't play on the team. So there's a quite highly sophisticated gradation, from an evil colonial point of view around these questions. And then there were always people that it was difficult to fit into the system, right? So what do you do with a Portuguese guy who's dark? You know, and of course Trinidad has everything that way. You know, there's Portuguese, there's Syrians, there's Chinese. You know, in addition to the major populations of Africans and indentured people indentured from India. So it's quite complicated to run an efficient colonial system, and for the most part, they didn't run an efficient one in Trinidad. It was too rebellious, too many mosquitoes. There's lots of reasons, you know, but one of them was that they wanted to structure a system of control that was being constantly undermined by the people they were trying to control. And cricket is a part of that. And maybe the next thing to do, Stephen, if you're new to cricket, because I can hear a little, like, you know, football bias in your question. And if you haven't, is to watch Fire in Babylon, which is really the culmination, you know, of this breakout of resistant black culture in cricket, right? This is the film about the famous tour of Australia and England, where the West Indian Cricket Club really comes out as a political force. And it plays itself out through certain styles of bowling, which, by the way, the Australians start that shit. You know, but the West Indians finish it, you know, and basically bowling at your head, right? So that happens to them when they go down to Australia. And by the time they get to England, they're like, you want to bowl at the head? I'll show you how to bowl at the head. You know, they change the rules after that, right? But it doesn't stop the West Indian cricket team from dominating. But the figures in that, like Viv Richards, for instance, most importantly, though they're figures who fully understand the political importance of cricket, and especially of West Indian cricket. And so he understood that too. You know, he understood that the form that was brought there to contain people was precisely the form, as you're suggesting, that they manipulated to undermine that containment.
I definitely am. I do have a football bias, but the thing that I want to say that I think CLR James gets wrong, if I could say that, is in the middle section when he talks about the aesthetics of cricket. It talks about significant form, and he talks about the dramatic action and cricket as a sport. He wants to focus on it as a moment of a particular confrontation between two individual players. For him, the high point of cricket as art is the bowler versus the batter. And I think that's why he has trouble thinking of football the same way, because it doesn't have those moments of individual conflict that for him is the drama. It becomes much more of a fluid team thing where it's hard to find the sort of here are two protagonists. And I think if you're doing a psychoanalysis, that I understand why that makes sense for him. But I would be curious, what would you, if you tried to not look at moments of individual conflict between two protagonists, but in terms of the collective flow as being the story. Yeah. And he doesn't do that. But I don't know where you would end up with if you did do that, but it would be a different kind of story or a different kind of analysis.
Yeah. No, that's a fair point. And this is something that I think James struggles with throughout. And it's in the political realm, it's his sort of battle with Leninism. You know, he, on the one hand, these figures, these individual figures, are important for him and important to analyze. Think about the Haitian Revolution book, the time he spends on Dessalines and other things like that, right? But, you know, there's a conflict there too, right? Because although he has these really interesting late Lenin essays, essays on late Lenin, where he's trying to recover him from a bit of a Leninist analysis in the center of typical Leninist analysis. But he's not, you know, he's like a lot of us, he's not above certain kind of contradictions. And one of the contradictions is that he lives most of his life as CLR James. Like he's already this known individualized figure. And even when he goes into his most famous collective, where he's with Rana Diaskaya and Grace Lee Boggs, you know, and they're doing all the work in the US, when you really read from the point of view of the two women what was going on there, you know, it was not quite the ideal collective that you would want, and there was no moment where his sort of personality and sense of importance as a figure completely dissipates. On the other hand, he was constantly working against it. You know, so I mean, you go to James for phrases like, all the organizing is already done. You know, like he was constantly working against this Leninist frame that you were the one who was supposed to help the working class set up.
Every cook can govern.
Etc. So, yeah, it's contradictory in him, you know, and he's attracted to these powerful figures in the work that he's doing, you know. But he's also trying to check himself, you know. I think the Mighty Sparrow essay is a good example, right? So he has this essay on the Mighty Sparrow, Clipsonian from Trinidad. He's talking about how, you know, he's a better theorist than other people, you know, than real theorists of the Caribbean, etc. But there's always this question, well, where's that place you, James, in this, you know, thing, right? You know, are you saying you're like the Mighty Sparrow, or, you know, there's a lot of contradiction because he's such a figure, you know. And, you know, when he came here, like right here, just around here, his whole thing was to be smarter than the white people he met, right? You know, so he'd go to these parties and he would explain to them how they didn't understand measure for measure or something like that, right? You know, so he had also this very individual performance, like a batter, like a bowler, where you know this is the Viv Richards moment in him, right? But he is also one of the foremost sort of, you know, thinkers about avoiding, you know, the problems of leadership in left politics. You know, it's a lot of it's oblique, a lot of it's in asides, a lot of it's in small books like the cookbook. But you know, you got to give him credit. He's always thinking about this problem, even when he's guilty of it. You know, and certainly when he came here originally, he had no choice really, I think, but to be James. You know, and that's what he was around, you know, Bloomsbury. He was, you know, the figure, you know, he had to play through the racism of that. When people said, oh, let's invite him to dinner, you can't believe it, he's a black guy, but listen to what he says. You know, and then he goes on about Milton, right? So he's playing into that, he's playing off of it, you know, it's giving him something, you know, that he wants, but he knows it's a bad deal at another level, you know, to be singled out in that way. Anyway, you get my point.
Well, the reason why I wanted to start there is rather than starting with a book as an isolated individual or isolated two individuals or a crowd or whatever it was, almost start at an earlier point and then work back up to a more recent past. Because to me, I think the Undercommons comes out of not just James, but also a whole series of of friends and comrades who were constantly thinking what they're talking to and remembering and bringing together, either for a text or for a drink or for a dinner. And it's, for me, the interesting thing is how those different layers fit together.
Yeah. Right. I mean, the Undercommons isn't really a book in that sense. It was just like essays that came together because of different social situations, which you then put together. And, you try to keep some of that in the language and style and in the form of publication. But inevitably, it also becomes an object. I remember once Fred was being headhunted by Yale University, and the woman who will remain nameless, but who was a big figure at Yale, said, well, we really want to bring the Undercommons to Yale. And I'm like, do you understand how weird that is, what you just said? But they didn't, because it was an object at that point, And
Well, here's an interesting thing. If you Google the Undercommons, according to Google Books, the book has 165 pages.
Okay.
Now, the laws of physics tell you that this is not possible, because every page has 2 sides.
Oh, that's a good point, yeah.
So Google knows something that I don't understand.
I can't explain it. But I think, obviously we wanted it to be something that would be open, like that, and not really finish, and we would keep talking with people. And that's mostly what it's been. I don't know what your next question is, Stephen, so I don't want to take us in the wrong direction. But.
No, there is no wrong direction. I mean, I guess in a way, books are concretizations of moments and conversations, and we should understand as pauses or points rather than ends.
Yeah.
And it's useful to have them, but they aren't the ends. They're just a point where,
Hopefully, yeah. Well, I mean, there's the story that we often tell about the book, which I briefly should say, because we do always talk about it, which is that we knew each other for a long time before we started writing together, almost 15 years before we wrote anything together. And the book and the writing in it and the people we were talking to, they really came together because we realized that we had somehow gone down a wrong path, and that we'd been sort of professionalized and individualized by the university in ways that felt to us. I mean, now we would say it more clearly than we did then, because we were still kind of groping for some of it, but now it's very clear to us that we were involved in a kind of betrayal. That's more what we do in the second book and in this third book, talking about this betrayal. But now I see that that's what it was. But at the time, all we thought about it was, well, this really wasn't what we got into this business for. This isn't really what we wanted. And it's because we said that, and it turns out this is what everybody's saying in the university, that, people start to pick the book up as a book about the university,
Well, one of the editorial decisions we made, and I think we made the right decision, but we didn't make it enough, was to cut out some of the early essays you and Fred wrote about academic labor.
Yep.
And I think that was a good move, because there's a tendency to read the book about the university.
Yeah.
And I think that's understandable but unfortunate. And for me, the important point isn't the university. That's just where you happen to be while you were having these conversations. It very well could have been a conversation about people negotiating the relationship to almost any labor relationship, rather than it being a particularity about the university itself.
Well, you're absolutely right there. And sometimes we say to each other, we should just left that one essay out on the university, the 7th thesis essay, right? Or put something else in instead, so that it wouldn't seem like it was about the university. But it's also a fair point, because the university is our workplace.
Yeah.
So we had to deal with our workplace. And then it turned out that most of the people who read it, that's also their workplace. So they wanted to deal with it, and still want to deal with it. I was in a talk in Rotterdam on Friday, and they wanted to talk about Erasmus University. And I don't care about Erasmus University, but I understand why they want to do it, what they're going through. So over time, we've tried to become more generous about people wanting to go back and talk about the university. But we also always try to point out, look, we had to work through this. We were sort of like clearing our throats to do the other work we wanted to do, you know. We had to work through the basic problem that everybody has to work through, which is the university is not a fucking special place. It's just another workplace, you know. And that takes a while because we spend our whole time, if we're educated, being enchanted by these places, you know, and thinking somehow that they're deeply involved in whoever we are, you know. But you have to eventually say to yourself, this is not really that different than working for a car company, you know. You work there because you need the money, but you also should be working for the end of cars, you know. And that's how we look at the university. But you can't skip straight to that sometimes, you know, because people are processing stuff about it, and they have complications. But basically for us, you know, we take a wage from the university, and meanwhile we spend every day plotting how to destroy it, you know. And it's not a naive, you know, childish destroyal like, you know, let's set up the fire alarm. It's a systemic destroying of the university, which...
Perhaps the consolation, or maybe not the consolation, is 20 years the university is doing a very good job of destroying itself.
True, yeah, that's right. But it is important to say that this was the essay that went into the book is almost 20 years old, right? I mean, it must be 15 years old or something, because it's even older than the rest of the...
So that was first published in social text, right?
Yeah. And so, you know, for us it was important, and anybody who else finds it important, we're grateful, but we're also, you know, we're trying to suggest to them that, you know, one of the techniques of the university is to keep you critiquing it, you know. It's maybe its favorite technique. I mean, but critique for the university is like feeding it Red Bull, you know. It doesn't get weak from critique, it gets strong. And so that's why, you know, you need the work. You should take the work. I always tell my students, I have art students, take the work from the museum. You know, take it. You need the money. Just don't believe in it. You know, and just don't believe that. You know, don't let them suck you into it. You know, because they don't believe in it. You know, and that's, you know, like I say, we've kind of moved on from that because what we started to realize, not only was it just a workplace, but it was also just an institution, and therefore it actually has the same goal of every institution. You know, universities, their goal, their mission statement always tells you it's about education or something, you know, or a hospital will tell you that, you know, its mission is to heal people, or the police to keep you safe. But they all have exactly the same goal, which is individuate you and separate you and weaken you from any sort of collective life or action. And the university is the same way, and you talk about being destroyed, but one thing it's also become is just much more effective at individuating people. You know, they've put turnstiles in everywhere so that only your ass can get through. You know, you can't bring your friends or family or anything else, you know. And that's no accident, because that's its first goal. So when you argue with the university about, oh, you're not educating kids, they're actually looking at you going, what are you talking about? That's not our job. You know, we're here to individuate. You know, we're here to make sure that there's no possibility of collective life. You know, we're here to make sure that these people think of themselves as having individual bodies and minds and eventually careers and plans, you know. And that's the same with a hospital. It's the same with any institution. That's their first goal. The other stuff is secondary. So when you argue with them about, oh, well, don't shut down the healthcare, that's not the point here, guys. You're missing it, you know.
Well, see, it's funny because, okay, oftentimes people ask me, so like, say I'm going to be reading the Undercommons, how should I approach it? And I say, first of all, two things. One, read it with your friends. Most important thing, read it together. Two, read it as poetry. Sub-vocalize it, catch the rhythm, catch the enunciation, catch the sort of emphasis points, and feel through that together rather than reading it as a thing to extract a certain meanings from or pin down. Yeah. And I think for me that is the value of a book is less sort of like what it concretely says, but more, that's also important, but also how people have, what they've done with it together. Where you have people going on strike together, reading it on the steps of an occupied university, or what it becomes a collective space where the space created by the collectivity through it is almost more important than the text itself.
Yeah, I mean that would be great if that is happening. You know, I think everyone would want that with their work, and it's made a little bit easier by us because there's already two voices and then more voices behind that. So it doesn't make as much sense to read by yourself in those circumstances, and it makes more sense, we hope, to read it as a kind of whole sort of polyphony of voices, ideally, anyway, And also, like I say, it's just good to make free books, because then people go, what do you want to read? Well, this is free, And, again, we had the privilege to make free books. Fred had tenure, so he didn't need to, and there's no ref, I bounce around anyway, so it doesn't, matter that much to me. And not everybody's in that position. Some people are got to do the work, which is just what we're saying. Yeah, you got to take the wage at this place. That's not the issue. The issue is not to take, not to do any more than that. However, you decide to play it out, because maybe that can include getting some money to do the seminars you want to do, or to help somebody who needs money for a translation or whatever. I'm not saying you can't. You aren't constantly involved with the university, because we are. But I think we just, as much as possible, have to try to not let it consume us, including as critique of the university.
Yeah. I do think there's something particularly nice about or valuable as the reading group was formed. I may be thinking of this because Dunner's over there, and I'm thinking about, when did we first read Capital together? Well, actually, I've been in two Capital reading groups with you. Mm-hmm. Once in 2004, and then again with Matteo and Alberto. And
the 2004 was the one with Simon Lilly, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I love reading groups, but they're also it's important for us to know that that's not the only form that study can take.
Yeah.
That, can be 4 people fishing together, or people plotting how not to go back to work while they're on their smoke break. There's a lot of forms it can take, and it's all intellectual, just like it's all physical as well. Well, I can say a little bit more about the betrayal stuff, since that's...
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Well, I mean, one of the things that has become more in focus for us in some of our newer work was that trying to sort of escape through the Undercommons was also trying to get back to something. And one of the things that happens to you if you go to university, certainly in a country like the United States, but in a lot of places, and especially if you go to the university in a situation in which your family or your community is not used to sending people to university, you also get, you get sent somewhere, which is how it would be phrased by my parents, Fred's parents. We sent him away to university, And we found this phrase in a great Guyanese feminist activist named Ndaya. We were studying her work. And she talks about people being sacrificed into power. And she's speaking about, particularly in the colonial and then post-colonial period, the people who get sent away, to England, for instance, from the Caribbean, or to England from India and much of South Asia, to study, to come back to be, leaders in their community.
You could say the same thing for Singaporean elites being sent away to
correct,
to Cambridge.
Yes, or you could say, if you think about all the people from French-speaking Africa, from Francophone Africa, who ended up in Paris, or the people from Lusophone Africa who ended up in Lisbon, right? and they're expected to come back, and they're expected to be quote unquote leaders, right? Now we're not comparing ourselves to the Nkrumah and stuff like that, but the common phenomenon that Ndaya identifies in it is a kind of estrangement that very quickly turns to betrayal, and we can see that in the post-colonial experiment, where we have a situation in which the anti-colonial movements around the world, it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Irish one or the Hindi one, these anti-colonial movements, start with a kind of radical embrace. Then at some point, a post-colonial leadership delivers them into the hands of neocolonialism. It happens everywhere that we can think of. Maybe if you want to accept Cuba or something like that, but basically, most of these people betray their own people, their own neighborhoods, their own countries. In the essay, then Ndaya is talking about this. She's actually referring to a novel by a Barbadian novelist called George Lammon, who, coming back to what you were talking about around, individual subjects of study of regard, the way James would focus on an individual versus some more collective understanding of what was going on. Lamming tried to write a novel without a protagonist, so he was attempting to make the protagonist the entire village, and not to have any particular figure in it. And it was an effort in this direction. She talks about this novel, and of course what happens is this community sends somebody away to go to school in England, and he comes back and he becomes a politician in Barbados, and eventually he sells the village. He basically sells the land out from under the village, right, in an act of betrayal. And she picks this up as a more general problem and condition that, is not inevitable. It didn't happen to her friend Walter Rodney, but we don't know, but certainly in his lifetime, he didn't betray people. She's obviously trying not to betray people, but it's awfully common. It's awfully common, and we need to only look at the actual governments and leaderships today around the world in post-colonial countries to realize it happened, and to realize very specifically that people were sent away and came back and sold out the countries. Obviously, I'm not selling out many countries because I don't have any, right? But this phenomenon of being sent away and then not being able to get back in a certain kind of way, also has an everyday aspect, right? If you go away and you get certain kinds of education, when you come back, you realize that to a lot of people around you, you're still gone. Something happened to you. You're speaking differently. Or your plans or your ambitions are different, etc. Right? And it's not. I'm talking about anything deep. We all know that there's alienation from communities and families that occurs through this kind of mobility, but it's linked to what we do away, right? So what are we supposed to do once once we're sent? What are they actually asking us to do? Certainly they're not asking us to betray them, right? But what are they asking us to do? Are we supposed to speak for them? Are we supposed to become people who have some kind of second sight with regard to our people? Or are we supposed to represent them? And these are all very problematic positions to take or to accept, right? So we started thinking more and more about that with regard to going to university, because we were both sent in different ways and in different contexts, but when we were sent, we were also sent out of something, And in our cases, what we were sent out of was much more organic forms of study, and turned out much more radical forms of study. And so then you're in this situation where you're out, you can't really go back, So what do you do? How do you reject all the bullshit of well, now I just try to give back to community or something like that, right? Which is just really an example of your alienation and the ineffectiveness of having been sent.
Let me see if I can riff on that in a way which you might like or not like. There was this film that came out last year, but directed by Appenzazor, I think. And I can't remember the entire name. It's far too long. It's something like the years Fanon spent as the head psychiatrist at Bleeda Joinville between 1953 and 1956.
Did you see that? I wanted to see that.
It's amazing. And here's what I love.
It lasted like a day.
I've got the file for you.
Okay, good.
But here's what I love about it. So Fanon was briefly, not an intern, is trained at St. Albans. And so he works under Tosquelles, who is important in the history of institutional therapy, comes out of the Spanish Civil War. There's a football story here too, don't worry, it's coming. So he is trained in this tradition of institutional therapy, institutional critique. The institution is sick. How can you heal the patient until you fix the institution? And I would say, but the interesting thing is that when he then leaves France to go to Algeria, into Bleeda Joinville, and what he's learned from St. Albans is things about like building football pitches with his patients, doing work therapy, finding, very Guattarian kind of things, of creating collectives inside the institution so people can feel valued and do stuff together. But when he gets to Bleeda Joinville, what he finds out is that the things that he learned in France go extremely well for the European females who are there. But the Algerian males are completely weirded out by it and don't want to go along.
Here comes the football.
So he has to readapt and he has to learn things. So he draws from traditions of local storytelling and theater and things that actually are, then become sort of setting up cafes in a way where it becomes, he has to almost rethink. So the point is that the institutional therapeutic approach, which is awesome, has to then relearn what it's doing after it gets sent away. It can't just move from here to there. Mm-hmm. It has to learn in that process. Otherwise, it's just becoming, let's take our fancy French institutional therapy and impose it on the Algerian context. And why isn't it working? Well, because it doesn't address the context. Mm-hmm. So being sent away is also having to think about the movement of context and how you switch in that.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Fanon is a prime example of the sent away. So he's sent away or sent himself away from Martinique, and the experience of being sent occasions the book. The first book that is largely about recognizing that he was in something and now he's out of it. And a lot of what he was in, he doesn't like when he sees it. But he also is somebody who comes into a new context and begins to realize, well, this ain't paradise either, And he's also a very problematic figure because, he doesn't really think about revolution in the Caribbean. He doesn't really think about the Caribbean as potentially already practicing, insurgent kinds of things the way James thinks about it. And his relationship to the Algerians is sort of weird. I mean, not in a bad way, but in a way that has bear examining. If you look at his late passages, his late essay on Algeria Unveiled, where he's talking about the Algerian women who are becoming revolutionary, it's very sexualized. It's very fetishizing about their limbs, about the way they're walking now, about how they look, etc. Right? And there's the relationship the Algerians, including the patients, had to him, which on the one hand included the history of racism that was in Arab culture already, and on the other hand, also was what are you doing here? You're not Algerian, And he was aware of both of those things, and still, wanted to be in the midst of that. So he's not unconscious about these things, but he's also not entirely free of them. So he's an interesting figure to think about being sent away. I'm not sure that maybe, yes, you're absolutely right. He had to discover that what he had learned wasn't going to work in a new context. But at the same time, I think I don't know if I want to think about that, or I can manage to think about that in the same way as these other sendings. because I don't want to really return to I don't know how to put it, maybe to a standard narrative of, you have to adapt to the conditions of the local, circumstance, etc.
Yeah.
Because it normalizes something which I'm sort of trying to call into question here, which is, can one just move smoothly with the proper adaptations through these kinds of situations, and what is the consequence for what you leave behind? And this is I think Fanon is a great person to study for those reasons, because he left behind the Caribbean, and he wrote this book, which he left behind, right? With the Black Skins, White Mask book, which then developed a kind of life of its own in various contexts, most recently in the Afro-pessimist context, right? So, there's a lot to study with him because it's very complicated what happened, or, how to understand it. For instance, the Afro-pessimists, they don't even rate the Algerian stuff. They're like, oh, he was enthralled with, a romantic idea of revolution, and, he was in love with Algerian women, and he was sick, and they have a million things to say about why you shouldn't read that book, right? Except for the one thing they probably should say is, well, you should read it so you can understand us better, But they don't do that, They focus on the early book, and they have a kind of relationship to this book which can't be denied. It's really important to them, and they come back to it again and again. It's a small book. It feels like it can't bear the pressure of all the work they put in it. But if you look at something like David Marriott's book, it's like, exhaustively that way. And similarly, if Lewis Gordon replies, it's exhausting how much they put into that stuff. And some of it is because, Afro-pessimists are the classic sent away people, I mean, if you look at the biographies of any of these people, they were sent away, and they were sent away sometimes even before they were born. And by that I mean that these are not people who grew up in black communities, right? That's almost the definition of an Afro-pessimist, Frank Wilderson says, he's obviously the leader of that movement, and a brilliant guy. He says, I never felt comfortable around black people, So he's not saying that idly. He's saying that to try to indicate what kind of connection he has with Fanon, who also didn't feel comfortable around black people. Let's admit it, that's just the case, He was brown, and he understood himself as brown, and he didn't know about black people in Martinique. You talk to any Martinican, they will tell you that, So he was, these forms of alienation, which is, I think they're really important to how we actually end up formulating our practices, including our revolutionary practices, He's a great one to study for this.
Speaking of Afro-pessimism, when we did the interview in the Undercommons, there was about 5 or 6 minutes where my recording device failed, and I didn't realize, and the battery, I mean,
This is the original book?
Yeah. Do you remember what we talked about in that 5 or 6 minutes? No. It was hilarious.
Oh, really?
No, so this was the section where Fred was talking about the Harvard debate team was getting its ass kicked by the prison debate team who were learning from Afro-pessimism.
Yes.
And they were calling on him as basically the Afro-optimist guy who was going to offer a counter to the Afro-pessimists.
Yes.
And Fred was like, what the hell?
You'd be surprised how often we get contacted by debate teams in the U.S., and they want to talk about Afro-pessimism, they want to talk about black studies, because these are mostly black-dominated teams. They've realized that they can fuck with these white kids around this stuff. If they get it right, the white kids have just no comeback on a lot of it. And this is one of the powers and attractions of Afro-pessimism, which in those moments we're kind of being included in. Because essentially what they're really talking about is, can you give us really like an absolutely frank and honest approach to racial capitalism and white supremacy, so we can use it in the debate, right? And this is one of the powers of Afro-pessimism. I mean, they're brilliant guys, mostly men. There are a few younger women who are involved in it and who are also great. and you can see why they're attractive, why they got to be important in American academia, because they arose in a kind of, they were already around, but they're interested and rose in the post-Obama period, right, in which essentially younger people, especially in universities and activists, were like, okay, well, this isn't going to work. This whole idea that getting a black president was going to do anything for anybody has been borne out in the blood of the streets, that it's not gonna, So they're looking for something more radical. Afro-pessimists are, unflinching in that radicality, and also, you remember when you're a graduate student, you're always looking for the most radical thing and the toughest argument, and quite rightly, you have the energy to, enter the debate in that way. And when, Frank says something like, no slave, no world, that's, what are you going to say in response to that, these guys are like, the only thing we can do is have the end of the world. And that's, if you're on the other side, saying, yeah, but what about transference and Lacan? You're toast, So there's a lot that's very appealing, besides the fact that they're bright and they're good scholars. But there's also, there's a small part of it, which obviously Fred and I sort of dissent from, and that largely has to do with this question. What's your relationship to ordinary people here and what they're doing? And especially to ordinary black people, but also to, all kinds of communities that are or have been marginalized and oppressed. And what are you finding there? And they don't really have much to say about that. They would have something to say about it, but I guess from our point of view, it wouldn't be really a sufficient way of accounting for the constant insurgencies and resistances that exist in everyday life. So there's a moment where I guess our emphasis is a little different from theirs, but there isn't much daylight between us around the analysis of white supremacy or racial capitalism. And they do a good job of that in many cases. So I could see why they became so popular with a lot of graduate students, and I'm like, more power to them, They're focused on a little bit of a different thing from us is all, I mean, we're sort of more interested in some of the things that James is trying to find in ordinary Caribbean life, for instance, that had contained aspects of the alternative, and yeah, so anyway, of course, also because it's graduate school and stuff, people end up saying, are you for them, are you for them, and, but that was never for us an issue of, we're for them, and if they want to be for us, that's fine, if they don't, that's fine, but it's not like, over here, that Afro-optimist, party of two, So, yeah, anyway, I don't know what's going on about that.
One of the things that I've thought about doing to go in a slightly different direction is I've started to think about redefining minor compositions not as a publishing project, but as a space for study itself. And to think of it as being not we produce book, but we produce encounters, some of which result in books, but the emphasis being on the study and not on the thing. And I think that would give a different of a reflection of how you approach the situation. Is what do you want to do together? What sociality do you want to create? How do you want to embed it in which kind of relations, rather than thinking about it as a production of things?
Absolutely, I agree with you. And I mean, this is one of the questions that we had to ask ourselves about what we were doing in the university. And that by now it became a common kind of, punchline for us to say, what's the one thing you can't do in the university? And to answer that the one thing you can't do is study. And then to try to show how that's the case and why that's the case, and then to try to figure out how to do it nonetheless. And also to acknowledge that even though it's impossible, somehow it does still go on. Both in the university, but more importantly in a lot of other spaces. And even till today, we still talk about that. And I'm trying to answer your question because I think it's a great idea to think about what you're doing as study and then for it to produce publication. But it takes some, it also takes a little bit of a leap to to spend your time talking about what people think of as, well, that's just the process. What are you actually studying? What are you actually doing? What are you actually hoping to achieve? Why are you spending so much time talking about study, instead of just doing it or telling us what you want to study?
Well, see, the problem that it provokes for me is if we think about study not just as things result in books, but also as the four dudes fishing.
As the
four dudes fishing.
Yeah.
What form does the four dudes fishing lead to, or is it just the four dudes fishing and that's all it has to do?
Yeah.
Because I don't want to only fall back on book as object, but I'm also thinking about what else do you fall back on, or what do you lean into that's not the set object as outcome.
Yeah.
And that's the part where I'm not sure. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, the four dudes fishing should lead to eating fish.
This is true.
Yeah, because, it's connected to this other thing where that people say, well, why are you talking about study? Don't you realize that the planet is burning? And it seems like you guys are just like obsessing over some, format or something, right? I understand why people say that. I get that all the time from fucking Mandarini or something, right? But, on the other hand, when we actually ask people about it turns out that you don't really have to go looking for the politics in study, because the politics comes right to you. Let's just look where we're sitting, for instance, right? What if we said to each other we wanted to study here instead of listen to me? Well, the first thing is, we would ask a series of questions about, well, what do you mean by study, right? And what I mean by study is that you should be able to study whatever you want to. You should be able to study with whomever you want to, wherever you want to, and for as long as you want to. We can't meet any of those conditions in here, not one of them, right? And if we tried to meet any of them, we would immediately realize that politics has come to us. If you tried to stay in the building, they'd call the cops, or more likely first the janitor would come in and say, oh guys, I really gotta go, and then that doesn't work. He's like, all right, I'm gonna leave, but sorry, I've made him male, but I'm gonna leave, but you can stay, but I have to lock the bathrooms, so good luck, right? Or whatever. And then eventually they call the cops, and so you can't study in that way, right? You also, the question of who you can, and obviously not only that, does that mean we also can't study in the space we want to? Let's say we did want to stay here all evening. We can't study as long as we want to, because we're going to be closed off. But let's suppose that for some crazy reason, Royal Holloway, suddenly, became revolutionary and said, yeah, you guys stay, as long as you want. Do whatever thing you want in there. How long would it be before, we realize we have no money for food? How long would it be before a boss in another job is firing us or threatening us? The point is you can't practice what you want to practice in this world, and the obstacle is not material, the obstacle is power, And, there's also some really interesting questions that obtain to this, because we talk about being able to study with whoever you want to study. Well, increasingly, if you're trying to do that inside a university space, there's the question of who's allowed in the door, according to if they've paid, especially in the American system or the Australian system or something. But there's also the question of what do you do about people that you don't want to study with? This is right now. That's generally taken, that's dealt with by authority, right? But what does it mean to open study to people you don't want to study? These are all kinds of questions that we don't really get a chance to ask under these conditions, and they're all very political questions. So at the end of the day, we never really understand why someone's saying, "Oh, you're just talking about study. Why don't you talk about politics?" Because it seems to us like there's no way even to think about study without an immediate clash with political authority.
Two thoughts. First thought, and maybe this is a nice moment to remember our good friend Stanley Aronowitz. I remember Stan telling this story about he was working in a steel mill, and they started a group to read some fiction together on break time. And people are like, well, the union was like, what the hell are you doing? Why are you reading like fancy stories together? And within 2 weeks of having a group to read novels, they were going on a wildcat strike.
Yeah.
So sometimes the thing that gets produced out of the thing that doesn't appear important is actually super important.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why.
Yeah. Yeah.
Second thing, I was also thinking about, and like every other thing that gets in this world seems to get sucked into AI at this point, what is the value of teaching or learning or studying together that can't be automated, that can't be machine learned? And I think there's something about the giving of attention to a thing, whether it's poetry, whether it's drama, whether it's fishing, the cultivation of attention and being with something, whether it's freaking meditating, that actual process of revising and being with and working with something is the thing that you can't automate because, you can't. And for me, that is the value of study, is cultivating the ability to actually focus, to be with something and to learn from it. Not to an end goal, but just for its own sake.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying in the context of AI about the attention issue, for sure. I mean, when we talk about what we're trying to do when we're in studying, imagine that we could do it, since usually we can't, or imagining that it happens, but always under conditions that are not really great, we're really talking about a kind of attention that's the opposite of most of the ways that it's rendered. Because for us, the real purpose of study is to help ourselves and to help whatever we're looking at fall apart. And so the attention is not for us to spend a long time looking at that painting until we really have it as an illumination. It's to spend enough time that we're actually looking right through it and it's disappeared. And hopefully with its disappearance, our own disappearance. That is, the problem with thinking about attention is that it tends to draw you back to a subject-object relation.
There is no spoon, there is no painting.
There you go. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I like to pay attention to things myself, but there's a way in study where you also have to say, well, the point is not to get an object in a stronger and stronger position to reinforce subjects, because part of what we're trying to do here is undo the kind of subjectivity that has been produced through individuation in institutions and in capitalism at large, right? So the point of study is to break down some of those identities and to try to come away, incomplete. To try to come away without a sense that one is supposed to be, independent or sovereign or whatever word we bang around those things. I mean, that's why Fred and I started writing together. It was not to create even more Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, but less. And it didn't work. But I mean, the idea was to, lose yourself in collective processes of writing or whatever else. And that, works to the extent that we can't necessarily tell you who thought what or who wrote what, but of course it's in a larger context and you're still identified in various kinds of ways, even if it's as two names rather than one. So, I'm not going to pretend that it was that effective, but the point of it was to get away from thinking of myself as someone who has, that's my idea, that thought is my property, I cultivated it, and then now therefore I own it, so please cite me. As Fred says, as far as he's concerned, citation is something the police do to you when they stop you.
One of the things that I really like about All Incomplete, that I think hasn't been appreciated enough, is Zun's photography.
Yes,
and the role his photography plays in the text, not as an illustration, but as a co-equal partner of meaning in itself.
Yeah. We've done more work with June now too. I don't think I shared it with you, but doing like art projects together and things. And he's been really helpful in our thinking subsequently too. So we came together for that, and we realized, like Fred said, we didn't realize that we were actually just writing captions for your photographs this whole time. But that was a bit of an accident, at least from my point of view, because I didn't know June's thinking and work that well. But subsequently, we realized that, all these connections between us, and he started to help us with some of the more recent work we've been doing on art and securitization, and we're writing together even now too. But he's also still producing art in the context of things that we're talking about. So yeah, I'm glad that you like that, because I always find it really, really cool to, and I'm always struggling with translators to tell them it's important to include the photographs, because a lot of times it's expensive or whatever. But I'm like, no, they're not just illustrations. They're, somehow he was already there before we wrote any of it.
Speaking of drawing others in, Alan, did you have a plan of wanting to draw others in, or do we just keep talking?
As you wish.
Well, I'm happy to do it in any way that you feel. You're the boss.
Oh, geez. How do I polish myself?
Yeah, exactly.
I'd like to ask a question, if I may. Well, it's just, I was listening to Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if you're familiar with him, the social psychologist who writes about his argument is there's enough empirical evidence by now to show, to make the case that there's been a rewiring of young people's brains caused by smartphone addiction. And one of the things he was talking about, especially for young boys and men, is that after hours and hours of addiction to phone, and he uses this language of dopamine, that anything which isn't providing that kind of rush is experienced as extreme and unbearable tedium. That makes any type of focus possible. And I'm wondering, is this a catastrophe then for the sort of possibility of studying that perhaps it's true to say there's been a great rewiring of young people that abolishes any possibility?
Well, I'm far from expert in the field you're citing, but I do often say to people, and you all know this, when we are talking about school, like even before we get to when you go to school, there's a basic process. And part of it is you're sent away, right? Just like I was talking about. I have a lot of nephews and nieces, like tons. And I've been to a lot of first day, I don't have any kids, but I've been to a lot of first day of school, right? And, most kids on the first day of school, they have the good sense to fucking cry, I mean, there's a few, probably have bad home environments or something else, who aren't crying or smiling, or maybe they're just dopey, who knows? But, most of them have a good sense to cry. Like, what are you doing, Wait, are you leaving me here, right? It's one of your first lessons in individuation, that you're not part of this family. You're a student, and there's going to be many more lessons, of course. Like you get in there and you sit down, and the first thing they tell you is you can't touch that person, and you can't touch that person, That's their body and this is your body, right? And this also never occurs to most of these kids, right? These lessons of individuation, they build up. Watch the clock. You can't go to the toilet anytime you want. All these things, that are inculcated with something. And I'm sure Stephen knows this, but in the late 19th century in the United States, there were riots when they introduced. Early 20th century, there were riots when they introduced universal education for kids. In the U.S. we call it the progressive era. And we say, what a great advance when everyone could go to school. The parents are like, we don't want these kids to go into this place, and they rioted, against the idea of compulsory education. They're absolutely right, of course, right? And in any case, these kids are forced into this system. They learn all these things about how, it's just you now, kid, right? And of course, this culminates in the report card when you're really like, geez, do I have... And it doesn't really matter when you go home with that first report card, not if you're in the system with those things, whether that report card is like a good report card and you have a smile on your face, or whether it's a bad report card and you're thinking, well, maybe I'll wait till my parents are asleep. It doesn't matter. It works either way, right? It's yours. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad, right? It has consequences, but it's done the same thing. Right? But of course, beyond any of that, being told you can't touch the other person, being told you can't get up from the toilet, being graded, the main thing you learn in school is how to be completely fucking bored. And this is the key skill for labor. It's still the key skill for labor. Go to the mall, and look at these people, who are just sitting there waiting for you to come up and go, do you have that t-shirt in my size? They're bored as shit. And that's why they're good at their jobs, right? Now, the phone is an interesting intervention in this moment, it seems to me, right? Because like you say, and if you're right, it causes a problem for boredom, which is still key to work, Everywhere is key to work, But at the same time, it also provides a solution, right? Which is, if you go into those stores, normally to get the person's attention, you have to get them to look up from their phones, right? And so I don't know what the consequence will be. I know that boredom is still key to work, and convincing people that boredom is necessary. And I know that phones have made a huge difference for bored people, because they sit there, like in Singapore, you remember, like you go into a store and you think, oh, there's no one working in here, right? And that's because everyone would be crouched down behind the counter on their phones, right? You'd be like, excuse me, and then, get up and help you, right? But it's a way for them to survive what is a deadly, boring job all day, and even more, and there are places where the phone has not been able to do that, most particularly anywhere that still has an assembly line, because the speed of the line usually makes it impossible for that kind of process. But you can believe the second that people come off, when maybe what they should be doing is reading a short story, coming back to what you're saying about study, no, they're on there, until the break is over, with one hand, a cigarette in the other one, and then back in. So I'm saying all that to say that, our job has always been, first and foremost, to make people bored. And I think I've done a wonderful job in the course of my career. I don't know if I do.
Well, I'll answer that a slightly different way. When I grew up, I read a lot, like constantly, and not like good important things. I was reading like trashy Dungeons and Dragons books, and I was thinking recently about like why my son Gustav doesn't really like reading, and I thought, like, is this a problem? And then I came to the realization that one of the reasons why I really liked reading when I was a kid is because I was very antisocial and I didn't get along with a lot of other people, and for me reading was an escape from the shit I didn't want to deal with. My son, somehow, despite having me as a parent, is actually much better adjusted. So his lack of engagement in reading is because he'd rather just be with his friends. So rather than going, why aren't you reading, you're thinking about like, geez, he's well adjusted. I managed to not screw him up. Good job. So sometimes, yeah. And oftentimes I think the reason why he's looking at his phone is because he's messaging his friends from his team and they're talking about something. So I think sometimes we confuse engagement with the device as a problem in itself rather than looking at what forms of sociality it's embedded in. Because for me, when that sort of the dopamine hit comes also as part of a social engagement is much less worrying than just the phone itself. It's what does it do? What does it connect to? How is it part of a social process?
Yeah, that's good.
I have a question from the chat. If you would entertain such a thing.
The chat, the chat.
Oh, and then also
So,
a few questions here.
Narayanan, who is a very enthusiastic PhD student, says the following. Could you say a bit more about how you reconcile taking the job because one needs money, but not believing in it? But also doing it well enough as to not get fired? Sounds like a superpower to me. In my experience, disenchantment is such a powerful feeling, and it leads to what people call quiet quitting. So it pertains to when you mentioned that you had actually been quite good at your job, even though you do not believe in the university.
Yeah.
Yeah. So well back.
Well, I mean, one of the reasons that it's helpful for us to think about it as a job like any other job is that I think there are a lot of places where, some exceptions maybe, NGOs or museums, where people don't really find it's contradictory to hate their job and take their check home. The university is one of those rarer workplaces, I would say, where people are, conflicted about this, and where their identities are attached just enough to work that they have trouble just taking their check and going home. And they certainly have trouble imagining a world without universities. And there's no time when I ever not have sympathy for this, because he just gave a perfect example. If you're weird and you're a nerd, the university holds out this prospect for you, right? It's like, oh man, I know a place where there's a whole bunch of people like me who just want to sit around all day and figure out an equation, or sit around all day and talk about, Othello or whatever, right? And so there's a very good reason that you get sucked into this place, because they tell you that this is the place you do that. This is a place where you can come and you actually escape all those other work and pressures that you don't want to do. Like, I don't want to go be a banker, or I don't want to end up, having to be a bin man or whatever, right? And so you can understand why there's an enchantment attached to it. I understand it, and I'm sure I wasn't immune from it myself, but I also feel a lot healthier and happier that I finally said to myself, it's just another workplace, And like any other capitalist workplace, my actual job is to see its end, In the meantime, I'll take its checks, But eventually, the point is that it shouldn't exist, because it's a creature of racial capitalism. It's not reformable any more than Ford Motor Company is reformable. Oh no, we're electric now. No, no way. It's not reformable. And I'm not saying, I feel like Hunter S. Thompson. I'm not advocating, drugs, alcohol, and guns. I'm just saying it worked for me. And so I'm not saying you have to say that we should be working for the end of the university, as we take its check. I'm just telling you that from my experience, it's made me a much happier, healthier, and social person as a result of that, and it's also helped me to not get too hung up on me, on this false idea that I'm a sovereign, self-developing, self-sufficient individual. It makes me realize that that's an artifice that they encourage in us. They take something vulnerable, like you love to study the violin or something, and then they turn it into something, that's harmful to you. Like, oh, maybe you can become a virtuoso, maybe you can be a soloist, right? And then the people who achieve those things are mostly unstable. Frankly, just like any big professor, when you meet like one of the really big ones, you're like, you're not right. Right? But also, they're doing tremendous damage to the people around them. Because you can't pretend that you really can stand on your own 2 feet by yourself without somebody getting hurt and somebody being harmed, and with a huge amount of resources being drained into that performance. I mean, just walk around here and just look at the statues of the various figures who appear to be standing, on their own in those plinths, right? But, think of all the people that produced them so that they could stand there like that, all the women who had to suffer to bring them out that day, all people stuck in colonial systems of extraction who had to provide that silk that he's wearing, That's what it means to stand up and say you're a self-made man. I'm a self-made man, which means I've got like 400 people working for me, whether they know it or not, and whether I know it or not in some cases. That's the only way I could actually stand here like this is if I don't need anybody. I mean, look at John Wayne, man. He had to destroy an entire indigenous population to be John Wayne. You know, it's a deadly form of delusion, mostly deadly to those around you, but it's also pretty harmful to you. And so this is why I'm saying what I'm saying about the universities. The university is a place that's constantly trying to do that to you. You remember if you did PhDs, you remember the first thing they said is, what's your original contribution to the field? I'm like, fucking nothing. There's nothing that you're getting from me that isn't already out there and social, you know. But of course you don't say that. You say, oh, nobody's ever thought about, Caribbean literature in this nationalist context. There's some bullshit, right? And, and it only gets worse, obviously. And, through the various management systems they put in.
Do you remember what you told me when I was finishing my PhD?
No.
You said, Steve...
I wish you wouldn't remember these things either.
you said, Steve, it's not your masterpiece, it's your freaking union card. Just finish it.
That's right. I'm sorry. It was a masterpiece.
No, but that was interesting. That was a good thing to say.
Yeah. It's your union card.
And the person who I would have called at this point, call a friend like we're on a game show, is I wanted to call on Peter Fleming at this point. Because if there's one person who's done a very good job at analyzing sort of how the subjective commitment to a certain kind of cultural politics is now the disciplinary framework of the workplace, it's friggin' Peter, right?
Oh yeah, he's the best critic of management ideology that we have, really, and a lot of management ideology is dedicated to that, exactly that,
But then I would also want to call on, was it the London Edinburgh Weekend Return Group, with a group of people who included John Holloway, John MacDonald, the people who wrote In and Against the State. This is the late 70s.
Yeah.
No, I'm just thinking of the way of I think they're making a similar argument in terms of they're talking about people who are working in social services, who are working in healthcare, and they're thinking about we want to heal people, but we don't want to exit the sort of, let's say, the biopolitical disciplinary framework of medicine.
Yeah.
So I think it's something where, for some reason, we think there's something unique about trying to pursue certain ends without believing in the institution that's unique to the universities. And I'm saying it's not. There's actually different histories of how people have tried to negotiate that. And
yeah, and I see that a lot around now that I'm teaching in an art school, about students' understandable commitment to art and to being artists, but also the dangers of that, for them, and they don't really like it when I start to talk about this. Because there's a lot of investment, in being an artist, and not just being an artist, but being an individual artist, And if you raise questions about this, even though they know, because they've met big artists, and they know how many of them are assholes, and how the rest of them are on various kinds of pills, not to be assholes, and they know it's a damaging process to stick yourself out there in that way as an individual. There's something goes wrong about that because it's false, but they're attracted to it, and they want to draw, or they want to do animation or whatever. So it's contradictory, and I'm really not there to tell people that you're falling down ethically on this. I'm only saying, like I said, that I found myself much happier and more effective by not having any commitment to the university, and I've noticed that they return the favor. Repeatedly.
Is it a bit like the main character in Office Space, where he decides he doesn't care and all of a sudden he gets promoted?
Yeah. It's a good one. No, because I don't get promoted. Okay. But it's a good film, and I do show it to my students sometime when we're talking about those kinds of things.
Can I come in with a couple of questions, really?
Yes, please.
Around three key themes as I saw it. Firstly, about cricket and the legacy of colonialism. And then you talked about Undercommons, and then finally what universities are all about. If we get the chance, I'd like to explore the other two, but let's start off with cricket, purely because of having an Indian background. It's in your blood, really. And I want to explore some of the complexities in terms of what you were saying, particularly around things like reverse mimicry, in terms of just challenging those traditional hierarchies, cricket coming from England, going to the West Indies that you mentioned, India, Pakistan, etc. And then when those countries suddenly beat England, there's that huge national pride and be challenging those hierarchies. Also the notion of cricket diplomacy. You might have heard of, in the news at the moment, huge tension between India and Pakistan. But the biggest thing in cricket at the moment is the IPL League.
Mm-hmm.
Huge amounts of money, this, that and the other. But suddenly, it's as if peace has come about through cricket there. Because I've even got one of my master's students looking at a data set on it, but saying that should have that data set, but it's going to be a few weeks delayed, but they've come to an agreement where they'll allow both sides, even though they're technically at war, to play cricket. So that whole notion of diplomacy. Also that whole notion of cricket being a gentleman's game. And then what happens if you've got sort of riots in those other countries and it's not gentlemanly, and what that means. And then I was also thinking about that whole thing about that internal conflict, particularly I was thinking about South Africa initially, about apartheid and having black players in. But then I was also thinking about that whole notion of identity when you've got an English team with lots of players of Indian origin, Pakistani origin, West Indian origin, who've born and grown up here, but because of colour, they're not quite seen as English, if you know what I mean. And then, what else was I writing? Yeah, also the whole fact that cricket is predominantly male-dominated. I went to the first ever Women's International Cricket Cup final at Lord's when John Major was in power. And just saying that the week before that, there was a narrow win at Lord's where they finally let women in by 51 to 49%. And you almost have to be in your 70s or 80s to actually be a member of MCC. And the whole thing of having women in the game, much more dominant, but they're still very much a small part of it. And then adding to that whole thing about people who are second, third, fourth generation Asians or from the Caribbean, who, say like me, have assimilated and have a white partner, but in my case have two daughters, one who looks black and the other's blonde hair, blue eyes. How do you add that sort of complexity to that whole notion of cricket and colonialism? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. Well, I think you've already done a good job of doing that, and you're right, of course, about the... We took a narrow slice of a moment in West Indian cricket and colonial history, but it's a much broader discussion than that. I mean, just in terms of women's cricket in the West Indies, it's in the last 10, 12 years, it's been women's cricket that really has kept cricket afloat. Because the men's team has been kind of a disaster, more for organizational reasons than reasons of talent. And for instance, in Barbados, many a father will tell you, my daughter's playing cricket, kept my faith, in my daughter and in cricket during these long periods when the West Indies was, being humiliating in many of its tours and things. So, I mean, the questions of gender in cricket are very strong. The questions of etiquette are also, very complicated because it's so much in the English language if you inherit it, like that's not cricket, sticky wicket, all these, phrases which, imply the opposite of colonial rule. And by opposite, I mean fair play, right? I mean, cricket is based on this idea that, it's fair, but of course it was imposed and it was carried out under conditions where fairness was the last thing on the ruler's mind. So there's a lot of, think about the rebel cricket tours of South Africa, for instance. It's politics, gender, colonialism are rife throughout cricket, and it's far wider and broader than we discussed. For instance, inside the West Indies itself, I'm returning because I just know it a little bit better than some of the other scenarios and some of the other locations. There's always been the vexed relationship of some really amazing spin bowlers who are descendants of Indian indentured people, and what their place is on the cricket team. And there's always been like a tension between those spinners and the fast bowlers who have tended to come from the Afro-descendant communities, etc. Right? So the more you dig, the more you find it, which I think is where Stephen was starting when he said, when he quotes James, he says, I always get the phrase backwards. What are those? What do they know who only cricket know? Which is essentially him saying, you have to know everything about politics, sociology, and history to have any idea what's actually going on in that field, which of course runs directly and totally counter to cricket's ideology itself, which is, everything you need to know is laid out in white in front of you, and fairly so. So it was a pretty radical thesis in a sense, but of course he was already a regular cricket commentator, right? He was Leary Constantine had brought him over, and he wrote reams of regular cricket commentary, much of which is not that really remarkable and certainly not political. So I think this was also a moment for him, of change with regard to that. You've raised many fine points beyond that, which I can't address other than to say you're right. There are many ways to enter this conversation about cricket.
Can I come back to your point at the end about what are we doing in universities? And you said one of the things we can't do is study.
Mm.
And I just wonder, rather than sort of challenging you on it, I'm just saying from my own experience, whether it's easier to do the things that you were talking about much more in the arts, particularly in art education, because I started my career teaching architects, and there you teach students by critiques. There'll be almost 6 or 8 of you go around every student, or if they wanted to work together with other students, going around their drawing boards and critiquing it from very different perspectives. But they were allowed to almost do what they want, who they wanted to do it with, not necessarily where they wanted to do it. They couldn't do it in the park, of course. But predominantly, I was just wondering whether, if you're studying art or sculpture or architecture, it's much easier to study in the way you were suggesting than it would be, say, in a business school.
I'm teaching in an art school now myself,
Are you?
and I can see that there are differences from teaching in business schools or from teaching in social sciences. And you're right, some of it has to do with that. But I'm also a little cautious about it because a lot of what art schools do with and for students is something business schools would like to do with them, and just can't do it given the present company excluded the personnel they actually have, right? Because it's well known, these guys have covered it before, I'm sure, but one of the best models for a worker these days who's not charged with being bored, which is working in a factory or picking up garbage or whatever. One of the main models is the artist, because for people who are in tech or in other forms where they want contribution from your labor, not just repetition, let's say. The artist is a great model, because if you think about the artist, there's a number of things that you could recognize in many of your students. I don't know if it's as true in architecture students, but certainly in students that I had, they don't really have any separation between their life and their work, which is one reason it's hard to tell them you be careful about being an artist, because it's their identity, right? Well, you could think about this in the terms of, in the context of a workplace. What's better than having a worker who doesn't have any distinction between her private life and her work life? and who indeed has decided that fulfillment will occur through that art or through that work. So the artist is a great model from that point of view. The artist is also a great model because the artist presumes when they start their art, or the art student, let's say, presumes, I'm going to throw everything into this. I'm not here just to do a job. I'm throwing everything into my form. I'll be up all night with my animation model. Well, Google must love that. If you're working for Google and you think of yourself as an artist, and of course they will create spaces that'll make you think you are, You're throwing your whole self into it. Great, that's just what we want. You don't know the difference between your life and work. Great, that's just what we want. You know what else artists do really well? They starve. Yeah, that's one of their specialties, right? Perfect, because when we're done with you, we're done with you, So, yes, I see there is freedom in the art school that isn't there. But I'm also wary about the possibility of freedoms that were designated inside these institutions. Because it's like, I'll give you another example. I'm not sure I'm making sense here. I don't grade. I don't give grades. I don't have to. Not in my seminars. There's no grades. I mean, some people do give papers, but if you hand the paper in, then you sign the form. I don't even give papers. And I was patting myself in the back about this and how good it is that I don't, give papers and, how much freedom we have in the classroom, all this kind of art school stuff, right? And of course, then they put me on the admissions committee, right? We were talking about this just before. They put me in the admissions committee, and that was brutal. You should have heard how they talked about these poor candidates. I was like, what the hell, Oh, that's derivative computer art, again, delete, all this stuff, right? So of course, there's a whole bunch of grading going on before they ever get anywhere near me, right? And I'm sitting there all happy clappy, like, well, I don't grade. Yeah, but the only people who've got into your room have been viciously graded before you got there, So this is why I'm a little wary about thinking about freedom and space in that context, right? Because it might not be happening right there or in that way, but it's happening somewhere because we're in this thing, and this thing, has a lot of places to sort you out, So, I'll say one last thing because it's a very rich question that you're asked, which is, we're not saying study doesn't happen. In fact, that's also what we often say. It's a punchline to say you can't study in the university, so we can explore the problems, and we can talk about study and what might be different from that in, say, learning or education, whatever you like. But we also try always to say, look, somehow it happens. Somehow people are doing it, and this is where we ended up using this word undercommons, which I deeply regret. But. It's going on. Like we often say, for instance, if you come into a classroom as a teacher, when you start your class, you've probably just interrupted study. I remember Peter Fleming actually coming back to him. And someone was complaining at Queen Mary when we were all there. I guess they were bringing in more tuition fees or something. Oh, the students are so disorganized, they're never going to do anything about this. And Fleming said, oh, they're organized. They're just organized against us. And so, when you come in, you start a class, you're interrupting something, and it's because study does somehow happen in these places. It has to be many times furtive or fugitive or whatever you want to call it. But it's not like they can actually kill off our ability to study. But they're always severely trying to curtail it. And I think and that's a reason that we don't want to be, contained by the university in thinking about study, because maybe it's not the place that, you really can do that much of it, The contradiction in it, which Laura Harris often points out, is it is usually a pretty important gathering of resources. It's libraries, it's computers, it's other people who want to study. There's a lot of things about it that make it attractive and tempting to study. And that's what you have to weigh those two things. If there's a place where they can go in and make models, that's a resource. On the other hand, if we start to believe that it's sufficient, we can have our study curtailed in ways that maybe we don't want.
Two thoughts there. We have a mutual friend named Gavin Grindon, who, much like you now, has passed several times back and forth between the business school and the art school. And we've had this conversation where I would say, do you have more freedom in the art school? And he would say, much like you're saying, yes and no. There's many of the same problems of engagement, of distraction. Many of the same things that that we thought, as I thought, were business school problems, are just as much problem in the art school. Mm-hmm. It's a different inflection on them rather than being totally different. The second thing is, and back to cricket for a second, or sort of back to cricket. There's a part in Beyond a Boundary where CLR James says that in his life he's read only one book on football, and it's only ever going to read one book on football. This is my one book on cricket. And the reason why I read it is actually not to learn about cricket. It's because I want to write a book about football. And I didn't care about football until several years ago, until my son went football crazy. And for me, wanting to write a football and cultural politics, American politics, and through football is also, I know when we talk about our research, we're talking about things like world-leading bullshit or whatever. But for me, part of the reason why I wanted to do that is I'm having a conversation with my 12-year-old kid and what he finds valuable, and I'm finding a way to relate to it in things that I understand. So that's what I find really amazing about that particular CLR James book is I think there are relatively few books written that do a sort of really interesting, deep-seated cultural politics analysis of sport. Maybe some also stuff by Dave Zerzin, but that so for me that was the interesting part about it, less so than the cricket itself. Is that way of approaching any sport or any activity and teasing out, like Stefano was talking about, what are all the things that people know who only know the sport that you don't necessarily see at first. So it's almost like the interesting thing was the complexity that I didn't see there. Like when I was in high school, I would joke about I would make fun of the American high school football team, what idiots. And actually maybe I still want to say that, but it's interesting that when you do look at the sort of all the embedded knowledges and wisdom and implicit knowledges involved in cricket or football or anything, it's super interesting. So for me, that was the interesting part.
I mean, Chomsky always says this, right? He says, everybody says Americans are stupid, they don't understand politics. You should just go into any bar and talk to them about sports. And you see that they actually have quite a sophisticated analysis of the strategy of that particular sport and of different teams. It's not a question of, being too dumb to figure it out. It's a question that, most Americans know that politics has nothing to do with them. I mean, Trump didn't win this election. People stayed home and won the election because there were more of them than anybody else's vote. And it's always the case. Most Americans have the good sense, and I don't say good things about my people very often, so I urge you to pay attention. They have a good sense to know that politics has nothing to do with them, and they stay home and they don't vote, and they're right, It doesn't have anything to do with them. But that doesn't mean they can't do an analysis.
I was wondering whether you could extend the Undercommons stuff, because I don't know much about it at all, but into higher education. Because if I get it right, you would say it's almost where people like a West Indian child is sacrificed to be leaders of their community by, let's say, being sent to Oxford or wherever it is, and there's that estrangement and betrayal and so on.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering whether one could extend that into higher education, the way we have managers who come as academics and as PhD students come through the whole thing, but then they almost get sort of estranged from the work of research and teaching and so on and so forth, where they have all these normative metrics, how to measure everyone and everything, and whether that whole notion of undercommons can be applied in any way to higher education.
I mean, I think, it's a good argument for understand the university as just another workplace, to realize just how much alienation is in it, like it would be in any other workplace. And certainly, you can't miss that in the UK because of what they've done to all of it. You know? But I don't know. When I was saying earlier, I'm kind of sorry that we even invented this term undercommons, is because most of the other words we use are words that already exist, like policy or study or something like that. And the undercommons has always been the problematic one because it's a potential brand, and therefore potentially always ready to be marketed or for us to be marketed, etc. Right? So I sort of regret in a way that we even use it.
If it's any consolation, I suck at marketing you.
Okay, that's good. That's why I haven't seen any checks. But when we did use it, we were using it to first of all as a kind of critique of the commons, but a gentle critique, not one where we're like, oh, these guys are missing the point. But commons still had a kind of normative quality around who could be in it, who could be part of it, and where it came from, that we were trying to get away from. But most importantly, we were trying to indicate, just basic idea that things continue to happen. And they usually tend to happen in the places that are most dishonored. They tend to happen in the places that, where people are, not regarded with proper respect. And a lot of times when you're closer at this, it turns out these are people who are also rejecting the very idea of being respected by the system, or they're rejecting the very idea of being honored in the system, etc. Right? Not because they're martyrs, but because they recognize that that's a way to be sucked back into a system that they're resistant to, and because they want something else. So undercommons kind of was a way of talking about that. It's probably unnecessary. There's probably other words for talking about it, but it's generally about this idea that Foucault has, where he says after all that Foucault stuff that you have to sit through and read, right? He says, but somehow life always escapes, And that's really all we're really talking about in undercommons,
one way I think you could think of it, you were mentioning again sort of what happens when you go into a classroom and say, now we start.
Yeah.
What if, rather than saying, now we start, the question was, now we continue? How do you start from, not even start, how do you go into the study that is always already happening? I'm thinking about, for instance, at Essex, people complain about students who, rather than show up, one guy will come in with 6 ID cards and tap for all his friends. Part of me thinks that's brilliant. It's a kind of self-organization. It's a kind of mutuality. Rather than being angry at those people, can we say, hey, can we talk about what you're doing and how you're actually providing for each other and how that's actually a kind of study in itself, and build upon that rather than getting angry at it? How can all the conversations that are happening before you get to the room, how do you just continue them rather than saying having to stop them and then start? And I don't know how we would do that, but because if we try to do it, it'd be like, the meme where it's like, hello, fellow kids? It'd feel a bit like that. But I think that would be the question, is there's always already things happening. It's a question of how you build upon, learn from, and interface with them rather than pretending they're not there or now we just click on top of them.
For sure, and nobody's saying it. I know you're not saying this. I'm certainly not saying that what's going on is sufficient, because obviously if it were sufficient, we wouldn't be stuck in what we're in, right? But I think if we act as if these things are not going on, then it's almost impossible not to adopt a position of superiority with regard to your critique of the system, with regard to your sense of organizing or party politics, etc. And this is coming back to Fanon. This is an interesting question and problem for Fanon, right? So if you were reiterating again about the question of people having been sent away in the context of colonialism and then in post-colonialism. If you took some figures who didn't go away, all right, so Lumumba is an example of a figure who didn't go away, right? Maurice Lumumba in Congo, Maurice Bishop in Grenada didn't go away. And then you compare them to Fanon. One thing you notice, and I'm not trying to psychologize this, but one thing you notice is like, Fanon, he's all about the new man and the new woman, He's all about how revolution is going to have to produce this new figure, right? And now he's not bad at this in the sense that he's like, and this is what it will look like, and this and that. But he's committed to this idea, right? And of course implied in the idea is that we're not good enough right now, And sure, there's plenty of stuff that is not very good about us, right? But implying that, we need some kind of fixing, has a very dangerous side to it, but also might just not be accurate, really, in terms of any kind of revolutionary practice. So, it's not. So those guys, coming back to Lumumba and Bishop, you don't see that in their language. You don't see that they want a new person. In fact, the opposite. And here it's not always about being sent away, because Cabral could be put in this category too with Lumumba and Bishop. They're like, we have it. We already have it. They've oppressed it, and we need to organize it together, but it's already there, right? This is what Cabral is saying when he's talking about putting your hands in the humus of the people's culture, right? And you get the same thing with Bishop. Bishop ends up in the split with Bernard Cord, who did go away with the University of London, in fact, right here to the education school, wrote a brilliant book on racism against black kids in London. But he ends up on the other side from Cord. And it's largely because Bishop wants to keep doing popular education. Like he thinks, look, these people here are capable of all this, right? And Cord wants to rule from the top, And that's where the tragedy of the conflict eventually, destroys the Grenadian Revolution, which was not just a revolution for Grenada, it was a revolution for pretty much all of the English-speaking Caribbean. Right down to the fact that many people from all those other spaces were in Grenada through those 3 years. It's a very watershed moment that's under, not well appreciated outside the region at least. I don't know where I was going with all that.
My joke version of it would be saying that every cook can govern is different from saying that every cook is governing.
Yeah. James, even though we were talking about, certain conflicts in James that arise from being James, he really is somebody you go to again and again around these questions, because he really, like his book on American popular culture, which I have to say I really struggled with because I wasn't really interested in it, it's like about cartoons and stuff, and I'm like, but for him, this book was an indication of the ordinary intelligence of American people, and therefore about how they were capable of organizing themselves to overturn the system. And he goes to England, he shows up, and the first thing he says in front of all these Leninists, is all the organizing is done. It's all done, Now, partly he's talking about how capitalism has already organized us, but partly he's talking about, that's not our role. It's not our role to explain people, what's the matter with the system. I mean, it's not our role to teach that way either, And, they weren't happy when he said it, and it caused a big split here originally. I think he even had to move house as a result of it. But anyway, he's still a great resource for somebody who has faith in the resistant, insurgent possibilities of daily life, especially amongst those who've had their daily life most severely regulated and curtailed by capitalism, racism, etc. So we should all go read them again.
Can I ask a question? I'm just going to assume the answer was yes, and go ahead.
Definitely not.
Yeah. Right. Okay. I recently read a paper that I've used a lot from some of my own work by a guy called Simon Husted and colleagues, who talk about doomsday preppers and their organization. And basically, they come up with this concept to describe the situation as atomization. Right? right? So the maximum potential to sort of ascribe and enact a collective subjectivity with the minimum potential of any collective action in that collectivity or from that subjectivation. The example being if all the doomsday preppers do exactly the same thing, but they do it individually and they don't attempt to organize in some kind of meaningful way that could hypothetically be useful in the case of an atomic war or whatever. Is this in how you interpret this decollectivization or like this individuation that you say happened from in the school where like sort of that original collectivity of the family is disenchanted or sort of acted against? Or is this something else going on there?
Well, thanks because it allows me to clarify something about that, which is, of course, I'm not opposing, a utopian family or community against what schools do to us. I mean, one of the reasons schools can do these things to us is precisely because families and communities are already messed up to some extent, right? And incapable of resisting what that institution wants to do. So I'm not trying to contrast them, in that way. I'm saying the answer, we're vulnerable to the answer that the problem with communities or families is put kids in school, and that plays itself out even today in homeschooling stuff, where it's recognized that there are problems with the way, it's recognized. One could say that there are problems with the rise of the nuclear family, and one of those problems is actually sociality. It's not a social formulation, it's an anti-social formulation. And a whole bunch of those, including its patriarchy, its heteronormativity, a whole bunch of ways. But more than anything else, in its nuclearity and in its, its position as a unit of consumption, etc., right? As a unit of property, etc., etc. So the family is a mess. We know this from feminists and from long history of scholarship. The schools are not the solution to it. Just like there's no right answer to homeschooling or not homeschooling, right? Yes, on the one hand, you should keep your kid at home and teach him. On the other hand, your home's messed up, so you can't do that, for any number of reasons. You don't have the money to do it, people have to go to work, there's violence in the family, or there's simply just a sense of a nuclear family, which is antisocial, So you send them, and then that's also a mess, too, So, that's why we're trying to think in terms of an Undercommons in which some other kind of practice is going on, because those two options are not really very good for us, one way or the other, So I'm not sure that answers your prepper question, but it's an opportunity for me to clarify that. I'm not, proposing that there's some beautiful community out there that has been destroyed, not least as far back as I'm able to understand.
I don't know about preppers per se, but one thing that I do think of is I have some aunts and uncles in the U.S. who for a number of years were, I'll say, very religious conservatives, and they homeschooled their kids because they didn't want their kids to learn about the dangers of science, right? Mm. But what I found fascinating about it was the homeschooling wasn't done just in an individualized form, but there was actually quite interesting networks of homeschooling families that shared resources and connections and materials with each other. So I thought there was something really interesting about that. Almost despite the why they were doing it. Mm. Now, I this is where I'd want to look at the preppers, is because if there's going to be a freaking apocalypse, the thing, everyone imagines, they're probably imagining they're going to be like, duct taping machetes to hockey sticks and fighting each other with. But the thing that would kill you wouldn't be that; it would be the water system being messed up. Mm. So I would find it really strange if you're trying to recreate all these systems on an individual level, because that's almost absurd. Because but maybe this is why I don't hang out with preppers. I don't know.
The preppers is a really funny case. You read about that instance where the electricity went down in Texas and they all had assault rifles but no can openers. And it's like, it was a funny moment to me. The stuff I'm studying is more like they try to create new models of masculinity to achieve better romantic success. Like it's a red pill, gorillas, this kind of thing. But what I seem to have gleaned here is that they aggressively create a subjectivity, but no potential for collective action. Let's say that they identify that men are in some way structurally discriminated against. They reject the notion that it's worthwhile trying to address this in a collective political way. Instead, they cultivate this heroic entrepreneurial spirit where they individually then rise above these things.
Right.
And so when you talked about this decollectivization, I think it's a trend that I can really see in that data.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your extrapolation on this. I don't want to let other people also ask questions.
It sounds like people who spent too much time playing the Fallout video games and thought that was a good idea for how to organize your life.
I'll just ask one final one from me about Undercommons, which is your big thing. Has it got any connection with our English history of free commons and levelers, and there it's about land resources, but I just wonder if that whole notion of undercommons has any links to our British history around commons and the fight for free land.
Yes, in the sense that it, we were thinking about a lot in the context of the reemergence of commons as a term in the I guess in the 1990s in particular as an alternative that was set up by people like Hart and Negri between socialism on this side, capitalism on this side, and then this thing, the commons, which is not communitarianism, but somehow was nonetheless an organizing, principle, right? And so that was in the air, and we were thinking about that when we were trying to think about what we were doing. But the commons is also something that, it's generally out in the open. It's also something that can trace its history in the way that you're talking about, to problems of enclosure, in places, to histories of attempting to keep common lands, etc. And we were dealing and working, through and with people where that was not their history. Commons doesn't make a lot of sense for the context of the history of the Black radical tradition. Property is not about property. It's about personhood becoming property. It just didn't make sense to join that kind of commons discussion because it was a European-based commons discussion. By that I mean white also. Not aggressively or intentionally so. I have a lot of friends who've done a lot of work in these areas and who still, have all kinds of commitments to it as a term. But it just wasn't right for us. We had other issues to deal with, and we couldn't just adopt it. And so, we ended up using this term under commons. Like I say, I don't know if it was even necessary, but it was to make a distinction from that for a whole bunch of reasons. Because for people whose principal problem is returning the common to their own bodies, this idea of the commons as a forest we all used to play in together didn't really make a lot of sense. Et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of other reasons too, but definitely there's a relationship. It's not a hostile relationship, but it's a relationship of we're not ready for the commons here. There's other things to be dealt with.
The connection that I would make is through friends like the Midnight Notes group, like Silvia Federici, George Cafensis, and most particularly people like Peter Linebaugh, who comes out of the sort of a social history from below approach coming out of places like Warwick. And I'm thinking particularly of Peter's book with Marcus Rediker, The Many-Headed Hydra, where he's talking about the rascal multitude of displaced sailors. I think you could draw those connections there. I don't think they're formally there, but I think there's, something in the air maybe.
Yeah, no, that work is important, and Silvia Federici's book is key to a different kind of understanding, I think, of what kind of struggle would have to take place to have anything you could eventually call commons. But at the same time, it's not that important for us to define this term under commons, and and people can use it if they want to for different kinds of work. And for us, it's definitely not connected to the university.
There's
It's
this
not gonna pop up there for us.
There's just one point where I was asking you a question about trying to define study, and I was asking a bit from my friend Zach, and Fred had this response that was both brilliant and freaking annoying, which he said something like, if that's what Zach thinks, he's misunderstood it, but his misunderstanding is also study. And it was like, that's freaking too clever, stop it already. But the point being is that even trying to not define it creates a space to do something with.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be really consistent with a lot of our practices if we were giving people definitions of words that we used or trying to enforce those definitions. You know, they would stand for the problems we have, you know. And Undercommons' problem we had was the commons just didn't seem to fit us very well and to fit what we had studied and to fit people we were concerned with. So we ended up with Undercommons, and that wasn't to, you know, undermine commons. It was just to be like, well, we're not there. We're somewhere not there yet. You know? And so people always say, well, where is the Undercommons? And I always say, well, I don't know. It's not there yet. You know, it hasn't risen to the level of a concept, and it certainly hasn't risen to the level of being a common.
This morning, I randomly decided to ask an AI bot, where is the Undercommons? And what it gave me was a picture of a bunch of dudes standing in an alleyway.
Really?
And I was like,
that's not bad.
That's not bad. I think the guy got it.
I don't know why, but
I don't know how. Yeah.